Okay, so welcome to the Missouri State Capitol, first Missouri State Capitol. So, state park, historic site, we're geared toward the 1820s, early Missouri statehood and so forth. But the reason I'm here giving tours is I'm a history buff, so I want to put it in a little better context than that. If you'd visited St. Louis a few years ago, you would have seen a whole bunch of big birthday cakes. St. Louis celebrated 250th birthday. And the cake goes back to 1764. Pierre Laclede comes up here and establishes St. Louis. Now, St. Charles were actually about 5 years later, 1769. Louis Blanchette, and again, it's fur trading, that sort of thing. But going back even a little bit further, you go back to the late 1600s time period. French are, of course, exploring and doing all their stuff up around Canada. Doesn't take much of an overland trip to get yourself up to the upper Mississippi, come down the Mississippi in canoes and so forth, exploring, seeing what's down there. And there were simpler times. They came down, they looked around, they said, we like this. This is all French now. They basically claimed the entire Mississippi watershed. So basically everything flowing down the Mississippi and the Gulf and all that, they said this is French territory. So you get a little while longer, and New Orleans gets started, I want to say in the early 1700s and all that. But you get to the mid-1700s and St. Louis gets going. But it's also an interesting time period because it's right at the end of the French and Indian War time period, the 7 Years' War and all. And I don't know really what the dynamics were, but basically prior to the end of the war, France actually, through a secret treaty, ceded all that territory to Spain, one of their allies. Said, okay, here, this is yours now. And then I believe what happened is they had to actually negotiate the end of the war with Great Britain and so forth, and that sort of changed the terms of it. So at that point, everything from the Mississippi over to the Appalachians got ceded to Great Britain instead. So now it's basically split. This is Great Britain, this is Spain. So what we think of as Louisiana territory is now under Spanish control. That actually happened even before Laclede came up here and got the city started and so forth, right at the same time. But things were a little slow in taking control and all that, so they didn't even get to, Spain didn't even come to New Orleans until about 1765, and I don't think they made it up here to St. Louis until about 1769. So basically it's a French city, even though it's recently come under Spanish control. But so now you have the last half of the 1700s where this is all Spanish. Now the truth is, if you go around St. Louis and St. Charles and all that, you don't really see any Spanish heritage. It's all French.
Okay.
And I portray that as because Spain was basically kind of a caretaker government. They didn't have a lot of immigration to the area. They just had control over it, whether they wanted it or not. I don't know if they wanted it even. But basically, they control it for the last half of the 1700s, but it's mostly French people and all that. And my perception of it is it's kind of a money pit. As the Spanish government, they're not really getting much out of it. I mean, consider it Central America and the Caribbean and all these other places where there's wealth coming out of it, silver and gold and sugar and stuff like that. Louisiana, not so much. But you still have the administrative cost of a governor down in New Orleans, a lieutenant governor in St. Louis, the Louisiana regiment of the Spanish Army, and maintaining relationships with the different Native American tribes and so forth. So kind of a lot of money outgoing for not a lot coming in. You get to the last part of the 1790s, and I don't know if they changed their attitudes or so forth, much as they would have loved to have good Catholics from France and Spain come and immigrate and build up the area and make it a little more economically viable, that wasn't happening. So they kind of opened it up and broadened it. So they were giving out land grants, and it was okay. You could be an American, come in, you could be Protestant, it was all right, which is how we end up with the Boone property south of here. Daniel Boone, a couple of his kids, some other people came in and got these Spanish land grants. And the whole idea was after a generation or two, they'll turn into good, loyal subjects of the Spanish crown, and the area will be more economically viable because we'll have more people. But things have a way of not always going the way you'd planned. So Napoleon's now in power over in France, and I guess he has very grand ambitions. So amongst one of the other things, he decides he'd like that New World territory back. So he does a second treaty with the Spanish royal family, and I think he gave them a property, a part of Italy that he had control over something. But it was kind of a land swap. So France now gets back the Louisiana territory. Spain gets this other piece of property. So now it's back to being French. And of course, all the French people that are here are like, oh yeah, you'll love that. Of course, all the people, going back even further to when originally St. Louis got settled, everything that was east of the Mississippi, over on the Illinois side and all that, there were actually settlements over there at the time. There was not much west of the Mississippi, but there was Port Duchard and Cahokia and Kaskaskia and other places over there Of course, they didn't care much for the idea of being British. So if you could, you kind of picked up stakes and headed across the river to stay on the French side of the river, even though it's Spanish technically. So a lot of French people moved over here. So now France now has control over it. But things don't always go according to plan for Napoleon either. And I believe around the same time he had this big slave revolt down in the Caribbean he had to try to put down. And at first it goes well, and then it goes terrible and so forth. So long story short, after a couple of years, he says, well, I'm just going to get rid of that New World territory. So he turns around and sells it to the United States, and Louisiana purchased. So now everything that we think of as Louisiana, okay, it's back to being, it's American now. Of course, once you're American, then you've got to go through several categories of being territories, but the whole concept was you want to become a state in the Union, so you get representation in Congress and all that good stuff. So for Missouri, it takes about 14, 15 years. You get about the 1818 time frame. They're going for statehood. And one of the considerations they had is, well, where should we put the capital? And what they decided was they kind of picked a spot on the map, and they said, okay, it's going to be on the Missouri River within 40 miles of where the Osage River met. So basically central Missouri. And at first I thought, well, it seems kind of way out in the middle of the boonies, considering most everyone's over here on the east side of the state. But I found out after the War of 1812 finished, about 1815 or so, apparently that northwest quadrant of the state became the place to go. There's huge immigration. So by about 1818, almost a third of the population was living up in that corner. So, okay, Jeff City makes a lot more sense in that respect. But in any case, they picked this spot and they said, we're going to put a capital there. But they had to build it from the ground up. So then the question mark becomes, well, where are we going to go in the meantime? And different towns are sort of vying for it, but they ended up coming here to St. Charles for about 5.5 years. So early 1821 to late 1826, this became the capital. And we said, well, okay, what did we have going for us? Well, we had the river. We got the Missouri River right there in our backyard. And if you come here about 1820, it was actually done about half as wide again as it was now. It was wider and shallower in those days. So it came up much, much closer to the stream. Of course, okay, we're on the river, but let's face it, that's where everybody put their towns in those days, so that's not that big a deal. But if you head down Main Street here, you get down to the Trailhead Brewery and you head up Boonslick Road to 5th and 70 and all that, well, Boonslick Road's been around a very long time, and it comes from the Boone brothers, Dathan and Daniel Morgan, two of Daniel's kids that came here in late 1790s. I want to say it was about 1805 or so, but they actually took over a business venture from a guy. Turns out if you head west and up into that northwest quadrant of the state, there are some saline springs. So we think of places around here like Merrimack Springs and other things like that, and nice, cool, fresh water coming up. But depending on where you're at and the geology and so forth, sometimes it comes up as salt water. So a lot of times they'll call that, oh, that's a salt lick. The animals like to come lick up the salt and all that. But you can process the water and get salt from it. So the Boone brothers took over this venture from this guy out there and started producing salt. Well, of course, the trail to get there becomes known as the Boone Salt Lick Trail. And over time, it's Boonslick Road. And my understanding is it actually went a little bit past the Salt Lick and to this town called Franklin. And that actually is the stepping off point on the Santa Fe Trail. So a whole bunch of this kind of go west, all that was coming through St. Charles. So we're kind of like a hub city heading out that way. So that really helped us too. And then the other thing we had going was this building here. Charles and Rudolph Peck had come and built it. So this center section, ignore that one on the far left, but the two middle bays, they built that around 1817 or so forth. And what they did is the lower section part, that was your banquet center of the day. Weddings, funerals, the courts used it, the Masons met there, militia met there. Oh, okay.
All right, I take it back. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I got a phone call.
So, to be the capital, one of the things you had to have was a place for Congress. Well, we got those spaces, and the thing about it, too, is if you think about it, Congress was only meeting for about 6 weeks in the summer and about 6 weeks in the winter. So it's not like you had to have the space 24/7. So just block it out for Congress for those 6 weeks and so forth, and weddings and funerals all the rest of the time. Now, the governor and his staff was here year-round, so they got the front of Chauncey Shepherd's building here. So the upstairs up there, that was full-time, so yes, this was the capital per se. So we had a really good building, kind of fit the needs for them. And then, to top it off, we bribed them. We said, well, I'll tell you what, if you come here, you don't actually have to pay the rent on it for the first couple of years. The whole idea was the city would make it up to the landowners and everybody would come out ahead. So they said, well, oh sure, St. Charles sounds like a great place to go. So they came here, met from, like I said, early 1821 to late 1826. Jeff City's up and running. They move up there. And so the building itself just reverts to all its normal uses over time. Tack on about another 140 odd years, you get to about 1960. Well, the walkways had all been enclosed. There was an addition on the rear. The upstairs rooms had been subdivided. The front facade looked different, the roof line. It was basically a Main Street type building that had gone forward on 140 years of development and growth and change and this and that. And apparently it was not in very good shape, so they almost just tore it down and started from scratch. But the Parks Department got a hold of it and did a restoration, and it took them about 10 years, from about 1960 to about 1970. What they did is they came in and started taking it apart, and kind of doing investigative archaeology. Oh, look, we found a doorway in this wall. So that's how they found a big opening between the two, various other aspects of it. So they took it apart and rebuilt it back to what you're seeing today. And my understanding is about 60% of the brickwork is all original brick and so forth. About 80% of the wood, beams, the timbers, and all that other stuff. So they salvaged as much as they could. Now the back gallery, that's a reconstruction and so forth. The glass is not original, that's reproduction glass. There was some original window stuff, but none of the original glass had vandalized 140 plus years. So we got that rebuilt. They did some work in the backyard, not a lot. It was kind of a shoestring budget project, my understanding is, but they did a little bit of archaeological digging, which is why we have these foundations sitting out here. We know there were some other buildings here concurrent with the original building. Now, of the two brothers, Bluloff was a blacksmith, so I mean a forge area would make perfect sense, but they also ran a business, so it could have been a warehouse, or it could have been a summer kitchen, or it could have been an ice house, or it could have been another place to live or something, so not quite sure. The log cabin in the back corner is not original to the site. They basically took that from someplace else and put it here, and it is an early 1800s dog trot style log cabin, so the old basic concept is you could have lived in something like that in the time period. It would have been very, very common. We've got a garden and everything else set up, just kind of do period stuff. We also have basically a well portrayed. When they did the excavation in the backyard, they found, okay, there's a well here, another well, and so forth. So they found several well locations. They found several cistern locations. So that's what we got here. And a cistern is basically just a bucket in the ground collecting the rainwater from the gutters of the house. Because generally, if you dig a well around here, the water's probably going to taste terrible. I mean, most people on a well use water softener. Well, in those days, that was your soft water, collecting the rainwater. So for cooking and washing and things like that, anytime you could, you use nice soft water. They also, I believe, found about 33 plus outhouses or so forth, because let's face it, use an outhouse for 100 plus years, you keep moving it around, that sort of thing. So from here, we're actually going to go inside, so follow me. Any questions?
Not yet. Do any of the viewers have any questions? If you're just joining us, we are taking a tour of the St. Charles, Missouri first state capitol. I'm really excited about it. I can't wait to go inside.
How y'all doing?
Good, how you doing?
Doing great.
Look at the old timber beam. Ooh. They said, no questions. Don is explaining everything very good.
Okay. Well, at this point, you're actually welcome to have a seat on the bench. You're the rest of it. It's the only time you can sit down. Okay, so at this point, I actually kind of go back in time.
Actually, can I switch?
Yeah, wherever you want to be.
Well, lighting's much better.
Okay, I'll sit down if you want.
Sure.
I don't get to do that. Okay, so I'm actually stepping back in time now. Missouri wanting to go for statehood. The process you went through when you wanted to become a state, you basically petitioned Congress. So you write an official request to Congress in Washington, D.C. saying, we're ready for statehood. Congress then actually passes a piece of legislation called an Enabling Act. So it's basically their invitation for you to become a state. So they start working on the Missouri Enabling Act. And basically things don't go well. And you end up with the Missouri Compromise. when they originally start working on compromise, or the Enabling Act, one of the things that comes up is, well, we're going to come in as a slave state, and we're going to kind of throw off the balance of power. Now, at the time when we originally started going for statehood, there were actually 21 states in the Union, and the free states actually have the preponderance. So there are 11 free states and 10 slave states. But what happens when Missouri's coming in is we've always been a slave place. When France had established it, they had slavery, not a lot of it. When Spain took over, they didn't change anything. They kind of just left most of the French rules in place. And then when Spain was giving out land grants, a lot of the people who came in were from southern states, so they brought some slaves with them. So by the time we're going for statehood, out of a population of about 66,000, there are about 11,000 slaves, so about 1 in 6. So we are coming in as a slave state. And you occasionally hear that, oh, we're going to throw off the balance of power and tip it one way or another. But like I said, at the time, no, the free states actually had the preponderance. But the bigger picture was there was an idea of restriction. The northern states said, well, slavery's bad, but let's face it, they've kind of come to the conclusion you're not going to get it out of the South because it's too firmly entrenched. But what about all this new territory, new places that are going to be coming states? Can they have an influence there? And the idea was, well, let's restrict slavery to where it's already at and not expand to the new places. So a gentleman named Talmadge, a representative of New York State, he proposes an amendment to the Enabling Act, and it basically says, okay, Missouri, you get statehood if and only if you don't import any new slaves, and anyone who's born a slave gets their freedom when they turn 25. So by default, over time, it's going to have to die out. Well, of course, slaveholders don't care much for that. Southern states don't care much for that. And this is all going on in Congress in Washington, D.C., so you almost have the Civil War happening about 40 years earlier because they're sort of debating the pros and the cons of slavery in Congress, and that's never going to go well. So in that general atmosphere, of course, a lot of places, people are working for compromise. We can get along. We can compromise and do things. And so one of the compromises that comes up is, okay, you can have slavery in new territories, but only from now on if it's south of the southern border of Missouri. So a Mason-Dixon line type idea. And now I should actually step back. While they're going through all this rigmarole, trying to figure out slavery in Missouri and so forth, Alabama actually became a state. So they evened it out at 22 states, 11 free and 11 slave. So now theoretically we would sort of show the balance more to the slave states. But while they're working on the Enabling Act 2, then Maine pops up and says, oh, well, we're ready to come in as a free state. So they combine the two, Maine and Missouri. And when the dust finally settles, and the compromises are done, they've chosen that Mason-Dixon line type thing. Okay, you can have slavery. They do away with the Talmadge Amendment. So yes, Missouri, you can have slavery as long as you want. And they pass the compromise. So basically, they're now offering both states statehood. Now, Maine sort of gets their ducks in a row a little quicker than us, and so they become the 23rd state. And one of the things you had to do, though, is once you're offered statehood, you had to hold a constitutional convention, elect all your officials, figure out who's going to Washington to represent you, and all that stuff. But the thing is, you also then had to submit your constitution to Congress so they could take a look at it. And this is where they run into the second little stumbling block. In the original Missouri Constitution, there was a clause that basically said, oh, once we become a state and we start writing our own laws, we're going to pass one that basically says if you're black or you're mixed race and you're here, you're a slave. Otherwise, you got to leave. And Congress looked at it and said, we can't do that. That's overstretching it a little bit. So they're kind of at this impasse because they're not going to approve the Constitution, so we're not going to get statehood even though they've done the Enabling Act. So Congress passes a resolution that says, well, until Missouri guarantees that that clause in the Constitution will never be used to deny a citizen his rights, that statehood is denied. And so you come back here to Missouri then, and by now it's June of 1821. It's been going on for a long time. But they had chosen St. Charles to come to. So they actually met in this room in June of 1821, and they took what was called the Solemn Public Act, or the Solemn Public Vow, and they basically wrote, okay, we agree with the requirements of Congress. We won't, they didn't change the Constitution. They just said, well, we won't enforce that particular clause of the Constitution. So they shipped that off to James Monroe, and that's his picture over the fireplace in the Senate. He's our 5th president. So they send the resolution to him. So on August 10th of 1821, he then issues a presidential proclamation. Says, well, whereas Missouri has agreed to the requirements of Congress and so forth, I now proclaim them the 24th state in the Union. So that's our date of statehood, is August 10th. So now you've got just kind of the regular things going on as far as statehood is concerned. So as I mentioned, this is the House of Representatives we're sitting in here. So we would have had, I believe, about 44 representatives. Senate over there, you had about 15 of them. And they go through the normal processes and so forth of running the state and getting it going. Now, then a few of the things we've got in here that are just for tidbits and talking and so forth. The green tablecloths you see on the things, once I started working here, I found, oh, there's actually a legitimate reason for those tablecloths. Let me jump over here real quick. So, turns out if you're writing with a quill pen, well, you start with a feather, but then you take your pen knife, sharp little blade, and you have to carve this in a very particular way to make it work. So it's a few cuts this direction, and then you turn it, and you do a cut here and a cut here, and a little slit in the end, and then you're dipping it in ink, and you're writing. But the problem is, if you just put this on a regular desk and you start writing, after a while, that tip is finally going to give way and sort of break. So the nib, and so you're going to have to recarve it. But if you put a soft, cushy cloth underneath, oh, that lasts longer. And you spend less time making these and more time writing and so forth. So that's why we got our green, cushy tablecloth, base cloth. And one of the other things is, the ink of the time period is not like today. I mean, sometimes we'll actually just collect walnuts in the backyard, and if you throw them in a bucket and basically let them rot, you can end up with this oil that's like stain. So you can make stain for wood, you can make dye for cloth, or you can make ink depending on what you dilute it with. But if you make ink, you're going to sit there and write, and it's going to stay pretty wet because it doesn't have solvents that evaporate like they do now. So aside from your normal writing stuff, it'd be fairly common to have a sander. And it basically looks like a salt shaker, but it's got sand in it. You're going to sprinkle some sand on that document and let that sand absorb some of that moisture. And that's actually why we've got our little box here. It's for dumping off wet, lumpy sand. I'm just going to put it back here in the sander and so forth. But so it was a way of getting some stuff to dry up a little bit. And then we like to say that, well, yes, some of those representatives would bring in their laptops. So this is your 1820s laptop desk. So if you're a traveling businessman or lawyer, whatever, this is your portable office. So it opens up, writing surface, place for your quills and ink and sander and so forth, maybe a pen knife down in there, little place for documents and so forth. This one's seen better days. But, like I said, portable office of the time period.
Somebody asked if you said Jayhawker yet. I don't know what a Jayhawker is.
I think that goes with Kansas, doesn't it?
I don't know.
I think Kansas did. No, I haven't. I haven't heard that in part of the early Missouri stuff, so nope, hasn't come up.
All right.
So we're going to go in the governor's office now. Watch that.
Sure. The governor's office. All right.
Okay, so this gentleman here, that's Alexander McNair, the first governor of the state of Missouri, and there's absolutely no reason anyone would really know his name. But what's interesting is in that first election, he happens to be running against William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I mean, even nowadays, everyone knows him. And even back in those days, he would have been like the astronaut that had gone to the moon and back and so forth. So very, very famous. But turns out, after the expedition, Clark is originally put in charge of Indian affairs for the new territories. And then I want to say about 1811, 1813, I can never remember which, but at some point he's actually appointed territorial governor. So he's been here the entire time pretty much since he got back from the expedition. Well, now Missouri's going for statehood and he's running for the governor. But apparently he had several things kind of going against him. One, he was more old-fashioned. He was the sort of guy, well, I'd be glad to serve if you elect me, but he wasn't going to go, hey, would you vote for me on Tuesday? I understand his wife was pretty ill during that time period, so it's not like he was up campaigning or anything. But my understanding is probably the biggest thing that did it was, imagine he's been here, so say the last 15 years or more, dealing with the different Native American tribes. Now, whether he developed any empathy for them or not, he at least developed a working relationship with them. But let's face it, most of the people coming to the new territories, new states, just wanted them gone. So apparently McNair was more pro-slavery and anti-Indian than Clark was. So he trounces him in the election. So McNair gets elected, first governor, serves out his term. So he's elected prior to actual statehood, serves out his term. So the next gentleman here is Frederick Bates. And if you head over to House Park, the Butterfly House in the Olive Road in St. Louis. His property is actually a historic site right next to it too, so his mansion. Unfortunately for Mr. Bates, he dies after only about 9 months on the job. Well, so now, okay, let's go down the pecking order. Okay, Lieutenant Governor. No, he's actually gone. He's resigned his position. He's out surveying the Santa Fe Trail or some such thing. So they go to Abraham Williams, the guy in charge of the Senate, and say, congratulations, you're the governor now. And apparently he said, I don't want to be the governor now. So he said, I'll tell you what, I'll hold the position, I'll do the job, but you guys need to arrange a special election. So they arrange a special election, and James Miller gets elected during it. So Abraham Williams is around for about 5 months as governor, and then James Miller takes over. Now, by now, you're about at that 5.5-year point of, okay, we got Jeff City up and running. So Miller is the first one to actually head up to Jeff City, and I believe he gets reelected, and has a pretty illustrious career. So artifact-wise, one of the neat things we've got is the hat over here. So that's made from beaver pelts, or beaver felt. And until 1840 or so, when silk comes along to replace a beaver felt top hat, that was the high-quality one you have. I would say, nowadays, if you got a lot of money, you buy a nice car. Well, now, back in those days, you'd buy one of those hats. But kind of the backstory that goes with it, if you know from Alice in Wonderland, the character, the Mad Hatter, well, there used to be an expression, someone who's mad as a hatter. Because the hatters, he'd start with a beaver pelt, and he'd soak it in a solution of nitrate of mercury. And apparently swishing your hands around mercury really isn't that bad, because it doesn't go through your skin that much. But then you shave off all the fur, and the matting, or the felting part of it, is basically just squishing all those hairs together until they interlock and become one solid piece. And so you're doing that over a hat blank, and you're shaping it and so forth, and then you're ironing. And that's part of that process of stiffening it up and smoothing it out and so forth. But then you're breathing mercury vapors. And apparently, yeah, from your lungs to your brain, no trouble at all. And you got heavy metal poisoning. So after a while, you became mad as a hatter. So it was okay to wear the hat. You just didn't want to have to make those for a long-term period, or you probably weren't going to do too well. This little guy here is kind of, this is your candle maintenance kit. The problem with the candles of the time period was, as the wax burns down and the wick doesn't, it starts getting very smoky and puts out very little light. So periodically, you're going to take the extra wick, you're going to put it in there and kind of snip it off, shorten the wick, and it'll get your light back. So that's just your candle maintenance kit. And
uh-oh, I went down. Can you guys hear me now? All right.
Out of the room.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, we got a couple of little things. I mean, this guy, this is a lighter of the time period. This is a copy of it. It's not a very good one, but basically it's a flintlock mechanism off a gun. Flint and steel is a normal way for making sparks in the time period, and if you're the governor, you're not going to sit there and hit a rock and a piece of steel. So you'd have a piece of flint in the mechanism here, and you'd spring-loaded it. It's going to hit this piece and make some sparks. So technically, it's the back end of a gun with no barrel. It's just a spark maker. And you have a candle here and so forth. Okay, so now we're going to head downstairs. Okay, so we're going to go up this door and down this doorway right below.
Are those the original locks?
They're the time period locks, yes. So they're pretty cool. Okay, so if you like old rooms and old buildings, this is one of the better rooms we have. So those are the original hand-hewn beams from 1817 or so forth. And like the boards on the floor here, you can't hardly buy boards that wide anymore, much less use them as flooring and so forth. So there are a couple of neat little features in here. But, so what you add here is the mercantile, the dry goods store, the trading post, whatever you want to call it. So we've got some furs laid out. Of course, the whole idea was there's plenty of bartering going on, and you're going to bring in furs and you're going to barter them off for other things. This is a beaver pelt. So this is what the hats are made out of, is this fur right over here. And that's what you really wanted. Then we got a badger, we got a raccoon. Okay, we've got a skunk here. Now the thing about it is, let's face it, in the world of furs, skunks are probably not the top of the list that most people want. So what you're going to do is you're going to dye it all one color, and it'll miraculously turn into Alaskan sable. And that's what you'll go ahead and sell to people in Europe and so forth, is Alaskan sable. Okay, then we've got a gray fox and a red fox, and an otter, and a muskrat, and a mink, and an ermine, and a weasel. Just some of the various furs that would have come through. I mean, some of them would have been local to the area, and some of them would have been brought from far distances. You know, if we happen to be given the best price for those furs at this time period, or it was just the easiest place to get to. So you'd see a whole variety of furs. Okay, so moving down. All right, so if you're not familiar with it, this is brick tea. This is actually half of a brick. It's quite solid. This is a piece that's been cut off from there. Probably shouldn't say this. I'm one of the tour guides around here that says you shouldn't have this around here. All the research I've ever done on tea says that even though China's been making brick tea for hundreds and hundreds of years, the primary market for it was northern China and Russia. People over here like loose tea, kind of European ancestry and all that. So although this was available at the time period, it probably isn't place appropriate. It'd be like having, oh, and let me show you the samurai swords that were available too. So it's neat stuff. And it's amazing that it doesn't go bad. I've got a brick of it I've had for over 20 years, and it looks the same as the day I bought it. It doesn't rot or anything like that. And you can make tea out of it. You just have to scrape some off, add boiling water, and it tastes just like regular tea. Okay, when I was talking about the candles of the time period, the thing about it is a wax candle like we think of doesn't really come along until right before the Civil War. Because they discovered paraffin in about the 1820s, and they discovered stearic acid, I want to say the 1850s or so forth. So that's when your standard white candle becomes, oh, that's so easy and cheap and so forth. Prior to that, your basic candle was tallow, made out of beef fat. And this one's kind of nasty looking. But the whole idea was, you know, you cut off all the fat, you render it down, you can make tallow or make candles with it. Now, if you were fortunate, the second candle they had was a beeswax candle. So you collect the honey from the honeybees, you get those combs and so forth, nice waxy type material. So this is going to make a far superior candle. One, it's going to smell nicer. Two, the flame is brighter and so forth. So if you can afford to, beeswax, but let's face it, honeycombs and honeybees and all that are a little bit harder to get than just animal fat. Now they did have a third candle, which we don't have. This is another beeswax, but that is supposed to represent a spermaceti candle. And all you need is a sperm whale. But they're whaling back in those days to get the whale oil for lamps and things like that. And there's a material in there called spermaceti that makes very nice candles. I don't know if it's impregnated with the oil or what, but it makes a really nice candle. So spermaceti and beeswax, expensive candles, more for the richer and upper class and that sort of thing. Tallow candle for anyone else. Now, of course, if you have tallow, you can make lye soap. And the basic recipe for lye soap is you take a barrel, you put some holes in the bottom, you put some straw down there, you throw a bunch of ashes in it. Ashes from all your fires. And at one point then you start running water through it. And as the water leaches down through the ashes, when it comes out the hole in the bottom, it's lye. So it's very caustic, and you dip your finger in it, you're going to regret it. You're going to get a chemical burn. Well, if you get the lye at just the right concentration, and then you add just the right amount of tallow, and you boil it, you get a chemical reaction. Basically, you get soap. Now, what I didn't realize is basic soap at the time period was like soft soap, like what we use out of a squirt bottle. You would ladle it out, put it in a crock, and you'd have soap. If you wanted it to set up in a bar, you actually had to add some ingredients to it to give it a binding agent sort of effect and set it up as a bar. So they had bar soap, but they also had soft soap, which is something I hadn't really realized. Okay, so now we got some tobacco stuff. So these are just some tobacco leaves. There used to be quite a bit of tobacco grown here in Missouri. Got a twist of tobacco here. And of course, chewing tobacco was quite popular. Smoking a pipe was quite popular. You know, let's face it, in general, the concept was, this stuff's good for you. You know, it's a plant, it's medicinal, it's used for all sorts of things. If you had congested lungs, well, they tell you to take up smoking a pipe. Because the whole idea is it's going to dry up that gunk in your lungs and you'll do better. Of course, if you've got a fever, we're going to bleed you too to make you feel better. So, you know, I always tell people, if they ever invent a time machine, you go back in time, don't get sick. Because some of the stuff, not too good. The more colorful one with the tobacco was During most of the 1700s and the early 1800s, if you managed to be drawn out of the river or lake or something as a drowning victim, you're going to get a tobacco enema. Basically, someone's going to fire a pipe, sucking all that smoke, and then they're going to stick a stem of a pipe up your butt and blow smoke up it.
You got to be kidding me.
No, that was the standard remedy for drowning for 100 years plus. I saw a show based over in England, and you got the River Thames running through London, in a big city, so I guess you have drownings fairly regularly. But they basically had like a bellows assembly with a pipe built in, so you blow smoke. So, yep. Like I said, don't get sick if you go back in time. One of the things I like to point out here is all the cloth. We don't have a huge supply, we're just a lowly state park. But, we love to think that people in the old days were so self-sufficient, and they could spin that stuff into yarn, and then they could weave it into cloth, and then they could make their own clothes. And my portrayal of that is, there are people that could do that. Just like nowadays, there are actually people who could take apart a car engine, put it back together, and actually make it run. Let's face it, most of us could. And even in the old days, most people didn't make their own cloth. It was a huge trade item. So there were places that they did that 24/7, so that other places didn't have to. So not everybody is out there. I'm sure people are a lot better at making their own clothes and so forth, but actually making the cloth and doing all that, it was not as, everybody does that around every household, make their own stuff. Okay, so from here we're going to head over to the resident side of things.
Yeah, Brian, it is a monopod. My hands aren't that steady.
So out the door, and we're going to head over to the other back porch now. Up, down the stairs, and over there. So, the residents, now what we know is that Ruloff, his wife Adeline, and their 3 kids lived here. We're not sure about Charles, maybe he lived here too, or maybe he got a room someplace else where it was a little more quiet. It is a basic 1-room cabin, but they were upper middle class. It's big, it's plastered, it's in a brick building, so this would have been upper middle class living. But there are other houses of the time period, if you go back, that had a couple of rooms in the hallway and this and this. So this isn't the only style of house that was out there. It's just one of them. So I normally start over here in the kitchen area. So the whole idea is your basic living room fireplace, but you do have a crane for hanging things. You got a reflector oven for actually baking things. So the whole idea is the heat comes out, hits the inner surface, radiates down toward the center. And we actually use a newer version of this out in front of the fire pit in the backyard during big events and so forth. And chicken turns out great from it. And if you know what you're doing and you have particular racks and so forth, you can actually cook some breads and muffins and that sort of thing too. This is your toaster of the time period. So basically you stick some bread in there, you set it in front of the fire to toast, and you swing it around, toast the back half.
Fancy.
Of course the frying pans have little legs on it. We've got a mortar and pestle for grinding up sugar or spices or things like that you've gotten to make your food taste better. Okay, this item here, this is a Betty lamp, and it's a grease lamp. And I read a really good article about grease lamps, and the guy says no matter where in the world you dig, you're going to find grease lamps. And some of them are very simplistic. It almost looks like an ashtray. Basically, it's a depression. You can keep something that'll burn, and a little place for a wick to hang out. But his point was they're everywhere. And a Betty lamp is kind of a deluxe version because the wick sits right here and what drips off of it just goes back in the reservoir. So it's kind of like I said, the deluxe version. But the idea of the article was we historic places probably should have a lot more grease lamps sitting around and not a candle sconce every 6 feet because they just use these and you're not always going to have candles, but you can almost always have something that'll burn in a grease lamp because there's more stuff that'll do it. If you think about making candles, that tallow from the cow, that's great if you've got cows. What about pigs? Let's face it, people have been eating pigs and loving bacon forever. But bacon grease you can't make candles out of, but it'll work in a grease lamp. So Again, it's probably very underrepresented. So all the movies where everyone's always got a candle and this and that, they probably have a grease lamp a lot of the time. Because like I said, it was just a really, really common lightning source for the time period. Okay, so come on over to the bed. It's a rope tension bed, so the ropes hold it all together, and they also provide the surface that you sleep on. But the problem with the ropes is they stretch. And the longer you sleep on it, the more stretch they get, the more it's going to be like you're sleeping in a hammock. It's going to dip down. So what you're going to need then is one of these. This is a bed wrench or a bed key. And this is what you use to actually tighten the bed. So what you did is you came over here. This goes down one of the outside pieces. It gives you leverage to pull on that rope because all you have to do is twist it, and you can actually see the center of the bed rising up. So that tugs on that rope really good. And what you do is you put a little dowel pin in here that holds, and as you let go, it'll get drawn in, lock it in place, and then you just work your way around the bed. You know, you need several pins, and you just pull them out from the back ones as you go. But you work away from one end to the other, tightening it up every so often. So it'll be sort of a periodic thing you'd have to do. Now, of course, your mattress is basically just a big pillowcase stuffed with straw and corn husks and dry grass and other things to get you off the ropes. But then if you're fortunate enough, on top of the straw mattress, you got a feather mattress. So a nicer pillowcase, goose down, very comfortable. And then they did have sheets, and they did have blankets and all that sort of stuff, so that wasn't a big deal. Of course, they had plenty of fur, so we got a buffalo hide on here, keep you pretty warm in the wintertime. Of course, let's face it, you don't need a buffalo hide during the summer, or the bigger blankets and that sort of thing. So a blanket chest of some kind would be pretty common for the time period. Store your things you don't really need. You don't see any closets. And in general, you're not going to see closets as we think of as closets until sometime during the 1900s. The early part of the 1900s, they start coming in. I would tell you that an average person this time basically lives out of a Foot Locker. They don't have a ton of clothes, so they don't need to hang them all up. Now, as you got more affluent and more well-to-do and more bigger family, okay, you can go get a wardrobe, you can go get a chest of drawers, things like that to put your clothing in, but not so much the idea of a closet. Now, it is interesting, though. When Pierre Laclede is coming up to actually establish St. Louis, so he winters over in Swarty-Shard on the Illinois side, and he actually bought a piece of property. And the deed for it, of course, it's basically a whole quadrant of a block fenced in with the building on it. But the deed says the building had 2 rooms and 2 closets. Okay, that's interesting. You know, this is early 1800s. No, mid 1700s, whatever. But it's a French deed. So apparently, in the French terminology, the closet was not what we think of as a closet. Oh, you're going to hang your clothes up. It was the small room off of the big room where you stored everything you weren't using. So think of it like our basements and our attics and our garages, more so than a closet like we think of it. So it's basically another room. We've got the washstand over there because basic hygiene of the day was wash your hands and face. You know, the idea of taking a bath and all that doesn't really come along and become very pronounced and common until public water supplies and things like that. The kitchen table over here is set with pewter, and nobody likes pewter. Oh, pewter's terrible. It's got lead in it. It's going to kill you, and that sort of thing. Well, pewter is primarily tin. It's tin alloyed with other elements. And by 1779, they were making pewter that didn't have any lead in it. It's called Britannia metal. So you can't just look at pewter and go, oh, that's bad. But just using it as a talking point, I always basically say, well, you know, if you're really bare bones, you're eating off a wooden trencher, kind of a board that's hollowed out in the middle, a place to keep your food. Of course, then they had tin plates and pewter plates and so forth. And if you're a little more settled in town, you just get plates, what we would think of as normal crockery or pottery or earthenware or stoneware, whatever. And then, of course, if you're really well-to-do, you're going to go get china. It's basically the same stuff, but fancier. And one of the things I found out, though, is apparently most of the glazing used on pottery at the time period had a fair amount of lead in it, too. So I don't know if it was really any better or worse than that, the pewter at the time period. So, of course, we have a model of a spinning wheel. It's not complete, but kind of as I mentioned over there in the store, I doubt Adeline spun. This is a pretty good model, but it's missing a whole bunch of the parts here. But, you know, she could have. It was a hobby sort of thing, and you could do it as extra income and that sort of stuff. Okay, just a few other little quick things in here. We've got this table here. It's a nice table, but it's also a chair.
Oh, very cool.
Multi-purpose piece of furniture. Kind of a low chair. I don't know if it'd be the most comfortable to sit in, but. And then apparently the kitchen table will also turn into a bench. I've never actually seen it tilt up. The sofa is actually a sofa sleeper. I've never seen it open, but apparently you take the green thing off the top and it kind of opens up and becomes a bigger bed sort of thing. And I'm told there are not a whole lot of those that have still made it from the early 1800s, so we're quite fortunate to have it. Okay, I think that's about it.
I appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions for Don?
Let's see how we're doing.
See.
Oh, just about perfect.
Nobody has any questions yet. Don, I sure do appreciate it. That was a great tour.
And if I said anything that anyone takes a difference with, now that's a shit or something like, let me know. You can pass the word on. I try not to pass on too many historical myths. There's plenty of them out there, and I try to stay up on them. So I think most of what I said was true.
Well, I wouldn't know the difference, but
All right.
they are on the table in the.
No.
Or no.
They're over here.
Okay. Ed Hargrove says, "Thank you, Don." So cool. Michigan Mister says, "Good work, Don." From Njord, Orden. Njord, aren't you from Sweden?
That's cool.
Or Norway, or I don't know.
Sounds
So yeah, awesome, Don. I sure do appreciate it,
Good
and I
work.
enjoyed it a lot more than I did when I was
fourth grade.
Yeah, I think it was
usually
fourth grade.
Fourth grade.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Don.
Well, have a great day.
You too. All right. Well, that's all I got for today. Battery's running low, and I don't know where I'm going to charge next. I should be getting back in the kayak, but I don't want to. I love downtown St. Charles. The house, I believe, I don't remember. I can ask Don. It's probably on the front of the building. Hey Don, what year was the thing originally built?
About 1817.
1817. Appreciate it.
Pretty sure that's it. Because I think it was about a year old when we started going from statehood.
No problem, Ed. Live if I see anything else interesting.